Hello again, welcome to another edition of Northern Spotlights with me, Terrry Mcstea, and today I'm delighted to welcome legendary filmmaker David Puttnam.
Thanks very much, Terry. Yeah, I'm David Puttnam. My connections with the Northeast are that I was for 10 years the inaugural Chancellor of the University of Sunderland, and then for 5 years the chair of the Sage Gateshead. So fairly intense 15-year relationship.
And it would be lovely if you were here with us in Sunderland, but sadly for us, you're in your beautiful home in Skibbereen in County Cork, where you've lived for, 30 so years, I believe?
Oh, yeah, over 30 years now, yeah.
And I believe you and your wife recently became Irish citizens, is that right?
We did, 2 years ago.
Right.
Yep, after a lot of paperwork and a lot of delay, and particularly over COVID, because actually it was due to happen that the week COVID broke. So anyway, 2 years later.
Oh, really?
So we've been Irish citizens for 2 years.
Well, that's something we do have in common, because actually as we speak, I'm waiting with bated breath for my Irish passport to come through the door. So me and my sisters applied for citizenship, which came through in April. And then as soon as I got the certificate, it was sent back off to the passport office. And it was a really big deal, actually. I don't know how it was for you, but when that piece of paper came through, it affected me much more than I thought it would.
Well, it affected me a lot because I live here, and so it was like a double whammy. Ironically, it was 2 years ago today that I actually
really?
was sworn in as an Irish citizen. Yeah.
Wow. Well, happy second citizenship day, if that's a thing. I guess most people know you as a film producer, and we're going to talk about that, but there are lots of other things we're going to talk about. But I suppose for the viewers' benefit, and for mine, if I'm honest, what is a film producer? I think we all know what the director does, and we all know what the actors do and the people who light things, but the producer, I mean, is that the person who just makes everything else happen that we don't see on the screen?
Yeah, essentially, it's not a bad way of explaining it, but every producer is different. I mean, some producers are very, very technical, other producers are financial. So every producer is different. I happen to evolve a way of working which worked for me and appealed to me and allowed me to feel creatively involved. But I think the best explanation I've ever had, particularly with students, is everything the camera sees is the responsibility of the director. Everything the camera can't see, ultimately, is the responsibility of the producer. So yes, quite a lot of work. And every now and then I see people who claim to be producer and director. Well, I can't work that out, because that would mean I've been twiddling my thumbs all my life, because both are bloody difficult.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. And so when you started in that world, I mean, did you have film in your blood from an early age, or was it something you kind of moved into?
Yeah, I think yes and no. I spent far too much time at the cinema than probably I should have done, and may have been partly responsible for my appalling academic record. My dad was a photographer, so images and photography and all of that was I'd like to think in my blood, but certainly fairly sophisticated about photography. And then I went into advertising, and what I realized after about a decade is that I really would like to be involved in the marketing of a product that I myself created. And that's
Right.
really what did it more than anything, which is I'm looking at all these movies, I really love these films. I got to a point where I could see the marketing element being very, very strong in them. So I thought, well, hang on, that's the thing I know about. And that's
Okay.
really, it was the conjunction of those two thoughts, I think, that drove it.
Right. Because I work a lot with designers, and I think particularly those who design things for other people, I think they often have a hankering to design something for themselves that they actually own themselves. Was it something like that for yourself?
I think it probably was. I mean, I was successful in advertising and in selling products, some of which I was quite critical of. And in fact, my parting of the ways, in a sense, with advertising was when I was asked to handle a cigarette account. And I don't smoke, and I don't like the whole process of smoking. It's innately unhealthy, and I didn't want to do it. And quite rightly, my boss had said, "Look, you can't pick and choose what we want you to work on." So that was and I liked them a lot. I was very happy there, but that was kind of the beginning of the end, really.
I mean, you described film producing as a very broad role with lots of different elements to it. Was it a case of just you kind of learnt as you went? Because I'm assuming there was not a film production degree or something you could.
No,
you could
I mean,
do.
the actual process, there was no such thing when I started. Literally, I was one of the first governors of the National Film and Television School, which was essentially the first course. There had been a course in directing at the Royal College of Art, but that was it. No, I think I did learn. I learned on the job, and I was lucky enough to juggle together a couple of very early films, one of which was quite good, one of which was terrible, with the guys I knew from the ad agency.
Okay.
And yeah, just to watch and a bit like a ship's captain, carry on number one, and I'd watch keenly to see what number one did, and then try and copy the best of it and ignore the worst of it.
Because I was thinking about this when I knew that we were going to be speaking about, because I think in some ways making a film or being the producer of a film is something like starting a business. You have an idea, you have a product, you have to raise the money, you then bring a team together, you create the product, you sell it, and then you start again with another product. Is that it? So you're really a serial entrepreneur, I think, aren't you? In some sense,
it's absolutely true, and to a large extent, every movie is a different business because every movie represents different challenges. You know, where you're doing the story and everything else. The difference for me was that I learned very early on that if I was actually going to influence the film, I had to own the script. I had to develop the screenplay before going to a director. Otherwise, in a sense, you are a functionary. You may be a financial functionary or a production functionary, but you're a functionary. And I didn't want to do that. I didn't feel I had to, and I thought I had too much to offer, to be honest.
And indeed, I suppose that's why you went into production, to get away from making something for someone else. You wanted to own it yourself, I guess.
Well, I was used to working with very, very good creative teams in the ad agency, and I wanted to try and replicate those relationships. So I had copywriter in Alan Parker and Charles Saatchi, art director with Ridley Scott and others. So I was working with very, very high caliber of people, but I was part of a tight group that were doing it. And I wanted to replicate those relationships in the film industry. It wasn't that easy because that wasn't the norm.
So you've been involved in, well, you'll know far better than I do, obviously, but dozens and dozens of films. How did you go about choosing which film you wanted to make? I mean, what did it have to have for you to get kind of excited about it?
Well, on a couple of dismal occasions, what I'd chosen was purely to do with cash flow. There were 2 or 3 films I did that I had to pretend that they were films I deeply wanted to do. No, they were available to do. There was finance available for them, and it helped cash flow. But for the most part, they were stories I found, often in newspapers. Actually, I only ever once bought a book that I turned into a film, a book called Cal, which was a very slim book. And otherwise they were ideas I conjured up. Three of my first 4 films were basically autobiographical. They were to a greater lesser extent what the experiences myself and the writers I was working with had, and that's how we worked on them. They were quite naive in a way, but 2 of them were extremely successful, so that made a lot of difference.
Or was that an unusual approach at the time to kind of create something out of your own life? Or
yes and no. I mean, I'm telling my students all the time that the only real raw material they have is their own experiences early on, and in a way they need to write themselves out or create that and see who they are, investigate who they are, and then they can move on and start looking at other people's experiences. So it strikes me as common sense to use your own personal experience to create an identity for yourself. And if you get it right, as I did with The Day, and I think with Stardust, the audience responds, sometimes to an extraordinary extent.
It's interesting, I was listening to an interview with Neil Jordan on Radio 4 just a few days ago, and he was saying that a lot of his films and his novels, he didn't realise until much later that they were autobiographical, and they were from experiences that he'd had, which I thought was quite interesting.
Yeah, I think there's some truth in that. I mean, certainly the third film I did, That'll Be the Day, was consciously autobiographical, and also involved what might not have happened to me in my life and have taken a different direction. The others, it's more subtle. The others, one way or another, are all focused on something that's obviously very deep within me, which is male relationships, the depth of male relationships, the complexity of some male relationships, friendship, the damaging of friendships. Memphis Belle would be a good example. I just wanted to do a film about the fact that here's 10 people climbing into a piece of tin, knowing that they've got a 30% chance of being blown out of the sky. And also, what was remarkable, they were more worried about not being there if that happened to the other 9 than being there. I mean, that I found quite extraordinary.
Yeah.
So yeah, in that particular instance, courage, a film about courage.
And that was something that appealed to you in that story. That was the
Yeah,
kind of the part of the
I was
reason for
somewhat in
making
awe
it.
of I was somewhat in awe of my father's wartime experience, which was
Mm.
tough. And the fact that he came through it, and the fact that he was such a decent man, the fact that he didn't really want to talk about it, it really intrigued me.
And I think that's something that people don't always appreciate. They go to the cinema, they see a film, they think, "Oh, that was a really good film," and they don't appreciate the heart and soul and experiences that have gone into making that film by the producer or the director or whoever it might be. Hopefully, those things come across.
It's
But
just a silly little thing. I mean, first of all, Memphis Belle's dedicated to my dad because he died, and secondly, when he came back from the war, and I was almost five, what I remember most clearly was Sunday morning sitting in bed with him. My mum made him a cup of tea, and him singing to me. And the song he sang always was Danny Boy. He loved that
oh yeah,
song. So what I did with George Fenton was said, look, I want to do this thing. It's a tribute to my father. He wasn't an airman, but can you weave into it the song Danny Boy? And he did beautifully. So you have these other ways of being able to give a nod to or pay tribute to things you care about.
yeah, yeah.
In that sense, a very unique medium.
Yeah, and it must be a lovely thing to be able to do, to be able to put something of yourself into something that thousands, millions of people are going to see.
Yeah, I think there is, and I think also audiences recognise truth. You know, they do recognise it. So your truth, which you think is individual to you, is actually a shared truth.
Because I was thinking about some of the films that you're best known for, like Chariots of Fire and The Mission, and you mentioned Memphis Belle, even sort of Bugsy Malone, and they're very different. But I think for me, the thing that they all have in common is they've got a big heart. There's a lot of heart in them, and I think people who love those films really love them and respond to that. Is that? Would you agree with that? Do you
I
think?
mean, I think innately I'm an entertainer. There was a point, probably in my mid-20s, when I decided to leave advertising. I could have actually taken the expertise I had or the experience I had, and I could have gone into either the film or the couldn't get into television those days, either film or the music industry. And I can't really remember why I opted for film but maybe because I was even more in love with film than I was with music. Um, but I think, yeah, I think that those are huge decisions you make in your lifetime, and they're influenced by all kinds of other factors that crowd in on you.
So could we have missed out on a great musical star from the 60s and 70s if you'd gone in a different direction?
I've got a great photograph I was doing that with Ringo Starr, and I lost a bet to him, and I had to shave my beard off. And anyway, and I got up on, we were messing around, I got on stage with a guitar, and I still got the photograph of me with a lot of glitter around me playing guitar. And so I look at that photograph, I think,
I look pretty good up there.
I coined an advertising line for the movie, which says, "Show me a boy who never wanted to be a rock star, and I'll show you a liar." And I think there's
Yeah.
deep truth in that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, music's loss is filmmaking's gain, I would suggest. I mean, I guess in some respects, the film you're probably best known for is Chariots of Fire. That was your first Oscar. Is that correct?
No, my first was a Midnight Express.
Oh,
Chariots was second, and then in terms of nominations and winning some stuff, Killing Fields, and then The Mission. So I was nominated 4 times. I won for Best Picture once.
that was for Chariots of Fire.
For Chariots. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, when you're at the beginning of a project, is that in your mind at all? You know, what awards could this win? How successful could this be? It's just let's get it made and get it out there.
I just thought there was a chance to make a really interesting story. And what had actually happened, I'd had this huge hit with Midnight Express, and I felt that wasn't why I'd come into the film industry. I didn't identify. I know Midnight Express was a really well-made film. We bust a gut making it, but there was nothing about me in it.
Yeah.
And I wanted to do a film that better reflected the complexity and the things that I wrestled with, and that's where Chariots emerged.
And I guess the success of Midnight Express helped you to be able to do that, did it?
Enormously, yeah, enormously.
So the story behind Chariots of Fire, because I think the other thing that I found interesting, that a lot of these stories are quite they're not very well known. In fact, would never be known, probably, if it hadn't been for yourself and other people bringing them to life. So, I mean, how did that story, or how did you uncover that story?
Well, you just run through them. I mean, Midnight Express was a book that no one had ever read by this guy, Billy Hayes, about his experience in a Turkish prison. And what interested me was there'd been an English kid who was only actually 14 when he was arrested. So there'd been a lot of media coverage in the UK about a different kid. Right. And that's what led me, I think, to to that book. And then we were very lucky. We got Oliver Stone, who had written a couple of screenplays, but nothing had been made. So we got him very early in his career. That was good. And Alan Parker had come off Bugsy, which we'd done together. And so, yeah, it was fortuitous. But with Chariots, it was literally a paragraph in a record book that I found. Literally a paragraph in a record book about the Olympics. In the case of Local Hero, it was a small article in the Observer about an accountant in the Orkneys, I think it was, who had sued an oil company for spillage because in the fine print of the contract they were responsible, and he won.
Oh, I see.
So that's where that came from. The Killing Fields again was a single column in Time magazine about how this journalist had been reunited with his interpreter. The Mission was different. The Mission was a screenplay I'd read years earlier by Robert Bolt and always thought was a sensational film, or could make a sensational film. So there's no cookie cutter version of it, really.
But most people reading a short news story about someone in the Orkneys suing an oil company wouldn't think that would make a brilliant film. And I guess that's what sets someone like yourself apart from the rest of us, is that you see something like that and then you have that vision and then you bring it to life.
Yeah, I mean, I was very involved with the environmental movement at the time, and it struck me as a nice way, and have been ever since. It struck me as an interesting way of approaching an environmental issue that was kind of subtle and thoughtful. So there was that was certainly a factor. And I remember talking to a lot of environmentalists about how we could play that up, as it were. I love Scotland, and that took me up to Scotland, which was great. And I particularly loved the film that Bill Forsyth had done immediately leaving film school. And I bear in mind, I'd been a governor of the film school when he was at the film school, so I had a relationship with him.
Okay. And was that the? Because I know he did Gregory's Girl, which is one of my favourite films, but there was the one before that about the sinks, wasn't it? That sinking feeling, is that the one? Yeah.
And then he offered me Gregory's Girl, and I very stupidly turned it down.
Oh, really? Oh.
Well, I felt I'd done some rites of passage movies, and I didn't want. I wanted to move on. Was a silly decision, actually, but it did mean that I still wanted to work with him, and so I commissioned him then to pursue this Orkneys.
Oh, I see. So after all of that success in the film world, you then kind of moved more into doing TV work?
No, I was able to do TV work when Channel 4 was formed. I was on the lobby. I was one of the lobbyists who fought for Channel 4, because prior to Channel 4, you couldn't work in television unless you were employed in television. So you're either an employee of one of the ITV companies or you're an employee of the BBC. So what Channel 4 did was open up television as a medium to independent producers for the very first time. And I did a film that was the second night ever of Channel 4 was a film that I produced called Padang Yang Kipabang.
Oh yes, I remember that. Yeah.
I did 10 films for them altogether for Channel 4.
And was that different working for TV or in things that are going to be in the cinema?
Less pressured, more story driven. I mean, once you had a halfway decent screenplay, you weren't getting into all that neurosis about who was going to be in it and budgets, because we knew how much we had to make the films with. So we actually wrote to a budget, as it were. So yeah, we did 10 films, of which I'd say five were good, a couple weren't bad, and a couple were pretty awful.
I'm not going to dwell on this, but with all, it must be incredible to be at the Oscars and win awards and for things, everything, to see a fabulous project and vision come to life and people to love it. But it must be pretty tough when it doesn't work out. All the work that you've put into something and all the money that's been spent on it, and people, for whatever reason, don't respond to it. It must be hard to, or is it, to just pick yourself up and move on to the next one?
I mean, it can be gutting. I had what was in hindsight a fortunate experience. Our very first film that Alan Parker wrote, was called Melody, and we were pretty pleased with it. And I went to the press screening, or rather, didn't go to press screening. I was standing outside the press screening, pretty nervous, and I saw the critic from the Daily Express, which was a big newspaper at the time, arrive 20 minutes late. And I saw him hurry, and this guy called Ian Christie. And the next day, or maybe 2 days later, I'm at breakfast and I read his review, which was absolutely excoriating. I mean, he just destroyed the film. But I knew he hadn't seen the film. I mean, it was one of those films, if you didn't see the first 20 minutes, the film made no sense whatsoever. None.
Right.
And I think I was so angry and upset that I suddenly realized this is all, that you cannot get wound up by being criticized by people who don't know what they're doing. And that was a very strong feeling. Conversely, there were 2 or 3 critics that helped me enormously. Alexander Walker in the Evening Standard, Philip French in the Observer, who were very kind to me. Derek Malcolm in the Guardian. So I had some very good experiences, and I had a couple of crappy experiences.
And I guess going back to that kind of analogy with starting a business and launching a product, they're not all going to succeed, are they? And I think it's really about how you learn from each experience and recover and then move on rather than dwelling on it.
And there's a good deal of luck involved. I mean, in the case of Chariots, things went well for us, which in a well-run world wouldn't have done. So it was a very, very fine line between that film being a disaster or the success it was.
So that's the first kind of third, if you like, of your illustrious career. Because then in the late 90s, you became Lord Puttnam, and you started working in. How did that come about? Had sort of politics and political activity always been a big part of your life up until that point?
The thing I think that politicized me was the privatization of water by the Thatcher government. I thought, at the time I said, I was involved with the environmental movement from very early on, and I just thought it was insane. And I'm happy to say I think I've been proved absolutely right.
Well, I think we're reaping the rewards of that as we speak, aren't we?
It was a mad decision, mad. And it made me very, very angry. And so what I did was transfer what I knew about the environmental issues into political activism, if you like. And I was very fortunate in that a guy that I was working with at the time became Neil Kinnock's sort of right-hand man. And Neil taught me, I was a member of the Labour Party. I then left with Shirley Williams, who I was very close to and very fond of. And I joined the SDP. And that was slightly disillusioning. I didn't like David Owen, and I thought it was I thought just they spent their whole life arguing with each other. So anyway, Neil taught me back into the Labour Party, which was a very good thing. And that was about 87, I think. And then I worked very hard for the Labour Party, and we shockingly lost the 92 election, which was a real shock. And I had to make a decision. Part of me thought, well, I've given it a shot and it hasn't worked. And the other part of me thought, well, one last heave, which is very much John Smith's view. And so I got even more, if you like, engaged. So by the time of the 97 election, I was up to my armpits in policy stuff, some funding, all sorts of, I did a lot of work. So whilst I didn't have any, and also in 2, 3, I'd been given a knighthood, which was very nice, by John Major, actually. So I was already Sir David, and I got a CB under Margaret Thatcher. So I had a track record which was attractive, I think, in a sense, to the Labour Party. I was one of the few people like that who was close to the Labour Party. And I got the phone call, literally 3-4 days after the 97 election, asking me if I'd like to go to the House of Lords, which I absolutely didn't expect.
And that's literally how it happens. You get a call saying, "Would you like to be Lord Puttnam?"
It's more embarrassing than that. You get a call from Blair's chief of staff, and he said, "Look, don't say anything to anyone. But if we asked you to go to the House of Lords, would you be available?" I said, "Well, I hadn't thought about it at all, but yeah, sounds really interesting." And a few minutes later, I got a call from David Blunkett saying, "David, we'd really like to come and work at the Department of Education." I said, "Well, I just had a call about the House of Lords." So don't worry, so we'll sort all that out. But
you wait for 10 years for one offer, and two come along within a few days.
It was a bit like London buses, But then what happened was extraordinary. That was May, mid-May. I heard not a word until August. And I went to Skibbereen locally, picked out a newspaper and opened the newspaper, and I was in the House of Lords. It's the first I knew of it. That was it. Oh, I see. And I got home, the phone was ringing. It was a very nice man called Dennis Carter, who was the chief whip of the Lords, who said to me, "David, you read the news?" I said, "Yeah, I just read the news, Dennis." He said, "I've got one quick question." I said, "What's that?" "You are a member of the Labour Party, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah, I am, Dennis, I am."
I bet you breathed a sigh of relief then, didn't it?
No, there were 9 of us that had been put in, and apparently a couple of them had not been members of the
Oh,
Labour Party.
really? Right.
So he was terrified. He was going to be confronted by all these people who weren't members of the Labour Party. So anyway, that's how it all happened. And then I became very diligent. I was in the middle of a movie at the time. I was shooting a movie, finished that film, and realised that there was no way of combining the two careers. It wasn't possible. And particularly then, 98, the amount of legislation going through, a lot of very late night sittings, and God knows what else.
So if you saw it very much as a career, the next stage of your career, rather than because I'm not sure everyone sees it that way, do they?
2 things. Because I went to work for the Department of Education for 6 years. I had a job, as it were, within government. That took me around the country. I was already Chancellor of the University of Sunderland by this time.
That's right.
Took me around the country a lot. A job I was given was trying to find out what was happening with the teaching profession, about morale, conditions, pay. So I met thousands of teachers, and I visited hundreds of schools, and I reported back what I thought. I became very, very close to, very fond of teachers, and still am. I'm still patron of Schools Northeast, actually, and I like to think I became influential in moving the dial. In fact, interesting, I was reading an article last night in Prospect by Sam Friedman, who then worked for Gove. He said that a huge amount had been achieved during those first half dozen years of Labour government. And I think it's true. And I started the National Teaching Awards. I became chairman of the General Teaching Council. So during that period, actually for about 10 years, that was my life. I was working in the House of Lords, and I was working in the education business, if you could call it that, or education policy world.
So the education thing came about essentially because you were invited to be part of that department.
It was literally a call from David Blunkett. I'd had several meetings with him, and he said, "Look, we just decided to have someone from a different world to come and look at the education business and critique it, and what's done for it." And what I discovered was that teachers, for the most part, were utterly remarkable, totally unappreciated, and basically lived. I mean, the state of the average staff room in 97, 98 was a Kazi. I mean, it was awful. So I was able to influence changes in the staff room, and I worked for a fantastic woman, Estelle Morris, who started at number 3 in the department, then became Minister of State, then became Secretary of State, who was the most remarkable person to work for. Really inspiring.
So it's interesting that they wanted someone who had no, well, I'm sure you had experience of education and teaching, but no direct involvement in that world, to just come and cast an independent eye over it. Did you find that there were things skills you'd developed, or in your film career that helped you when you're engaging with people, or knowing what to look for? And
yes, I mean, one of the problems we encountered immediately was recruitment, recruiting teachers, because a lot of teachers were retiring. And I worked with a very nice guy indeed called Ralph Tabberer, and we worked up the campaign. You may remember it. Everyone remembers a good teacher. And I used my contacts to go out and get the Bob Hoskins of the world, John Cleeses of the world, just to talk about their own teacher. And it was a very, very effective campaign.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
So that did combine too. And then what lesson I learned from the Oscars, and the way that the Oscars influenced good movies, was I brought all that to the idea of the National Teaching Awards. I managed to get those off the ground, and 25 years later, they're still going.
Right. Wow. It's quite a legacy.
That is one of all the bits and pieces of legacy. I'd like to think that will be the most enduring.
Well, I think there are a few to choose from in terms of those things that might be a legacy. So, but I'm sure that'll be one of those things. I get in some respects. I mean, I started by asking you, what does a producer do? Because a lot of people don't really understand it. I think most people know what an MP does and a government minister does. But for someone in the Lords, it's a bit more, or it seems a bit more vague. Was it quite vague or was it quite well defined what you could do?
It was incredibly vague. I had not a clue what was going on. I remember a former chief whip, Michael Cox, I was sitting next to quite early on, and I said, "Michael, when you go any advice?" He said, "Yeah, just sit still, stay quiet, and watch." Which is what I did actually for about 3 years. And then I got a piece of luck. It was luck. I was given the chairmanship of what was to be the Communications Bill, 1993 Communications Bill. I worked very hard. It was a very controversial bill because what I was trying to hold off was Rupert Murdoch owning ITV.
Okay.
And so that got very tricky because by this time, at that point, Blair was quite close to Murdoch. So I was in a funny way. I was opposing my own government, but I was able within the group, the Labour group in the House of Lords, and find enough Tories, enough Lib Dems to actually beat the government. Believe it or not, I'm not sure I was that popular for a bit, but I was right. There was no question. I was absolutely right, and I created this what's called a public interest test, which is that mergers and takeovers in the media have to be subjected to a public interest, an overriding public interest, and it's still true. And that saved several things. That's one of the reasons why the Daily Telegraph deal has taken so long.
So that's over and above a purely financial.
It has to go. It's put to a test which is different from just money, or different from pretty well anything else. I personally have been an advocate. I think a whole lot of things should be applied at public interest test. Energy, energy takeovers. There's a whole series of areas which, in my world, which would be probably a left of centre Labour world, ought to be implemented. No, the public interest test ought to be fundamental within the process. I mean, at the moment, what we've got is mergers and takeovers commission, but that doesn't dig deep into what's in the public interest.
Yeah, I think it is very much still based on the financial benefits or implications. But as you say, and as you mentioned earlier, with the water industry, we're seeing now how ignoring what's in the public interest has led to the situation that we now have.
I mean, I'd like to think that a lot of the privatisation of rail, privatisation of water would never have occurred had there been a public interest test. But there was one. So all you had was shareholder tests.
Which are crude in some respects, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't think I'd ever feel this way, but to me, I'm looking back at this point in my life, I'm 83. During my lifetime, capitalism has failed. It's a failed system. I'm not suggesting I know what the alternative is, but I think that capitalism, as it's evolved in the last 20 years, is a colossal failure.
The rampant variety, which I think is what we're seeing.
Yeah, the variety that we're living with, the unregulated version. Yeah.
Because I know another area that you were involved in your time in the Lords was around the sort of the digital realm and artificial intelligence and all those sorts of things. Again, things that were...
I've jumped ahead. You asked about the Lords. So the next thing, I've made a success of the Communications Bill. I was then given in 2007-8, I was given the Climate Change Bill, which again was not a bad legacy. I managed to steer that through Parliament, and it was the very first piece of climate legislation in the world at the time.
Really?
And it's a good bill, and the Climate Change Committee that we set up still exists and still reports, and the government has to acknowledge it in setting targets. So it was a successful piece of legislation. I then, again, lucky, I got myself onto the AI committee very early on in 2008, 17, I think. So I was part and parcel of work looking at early AI legislation. I did this enormous piece of work. The very last piece of work in the Lords was on trust in politics. Surprise, surprise. What's the biggest issue at the moment? Trust in politics.
Yeah, you do seem to have been there tackling some very, very pertinent issues that are still with us.
Yeah, part luck, part commitment, I think, honestly. I argued against my party on tuition fees, basically because we had a manifesto commitment that we would not bring in tuition fees. And my argument was that once you start breaking manifesto commitments, what's the point in having a manifesto? Now, the counter argument was that British Parliament's last 4 to 5 years, that's too long to keep a promise. I'm not sure that washes.
Yeah, perhaps you shouldn't make promises you can't keep should be the response to that, shouldn't it?
I think that's not a bad, or certainly not without a tangible crisis. So
yeah.
For me, both the Lib Dems and the Labour Party really hurt themselves by the way that tuition fees were introduced.
And I mean, I certainly get the sense from you that the time that you spent doing that work is as important to you in terms of your legacy, if you like, or how you spent your time, just as important as the time you spent making films that millions of people have seen and have won awards. Would you?
Unquestionably, unquestionably, if I had to, if on my tombstone it just says David Puttnam, film producer, I'd be pissed off, because that was 30 years of my life, but I've lived a pretty active 60 years of active life. So I could settle for filmmaker educator. I prefer filmmaker legislator educator, because I've been involved, very, very involved in legislation. I mean, be careful what you wish for.
Yes, let's not think about that. Just that's a long way off, hopefully.
My point I'm just making is that I think
Sure.
my life has been significantly more than just film making.
Sure. As we are learning, indeed. So before we move on to that kind of what you might describe as the third element, I'm hoping someone's going to make me a cup of tea shortly, because as I mentioned earlier, one of the I do like to. Well, it's hard work, all this talking. So I think we need a little break for a cup of tea and a biscuit, perhaps, and then we'll continue with the more recent part of your work, if that's okay.
Sure, yeah, I'd like to talk about the work at University of Sunderland, which was certainly very important to me.
Okay, good.
Okay, I'll go and get myself a cup of tea.
Brilliant. Thank you. So welcome back. As always, I've got a nice cup of tea because it's thirsty work, all this chatting. And David, you have something more summery, I believe.
Oh, I've got a sparkling elderflower, absolutely delicious.
Lovely. Does a biscuit go with sparkling elderflower? Or
Not really, to be honest.
not really.
Because I can't dunk it.
Very true. Well, I've got some chocolate hobnobs, but I'll wait until we finish talking before I start tweaking into them. So we left you in the Lords, where you retired from a few years ago. Is that right?
2 years ago. Yes, 2.5 years ago now. Yeah.
So did they do a big send off, a big kind of retirement?
No,
do
not
for
really,
you?
because it was sort of immediately post-COVID. I was lucky. I was asked to do Shirley Williams had died, and I was asked to do a memorial lecture on her behalf. And I combined the memorial lecture with my what's called valedictory, my leaving speech.
Yeah.
So instead of a 10-minute valedictory, I got a half-hour lecture in, and I'm afraid I really pummeled the government. I pummeled politics, but I really pummeled the government. It was the toughest speech I worked very hard on it, but I really went for it.
I guess that was one of your last opportunities to do that. So then you took it. Yeah.
Well, what I talked about was the fact that listening during Brexit, I mean, I was very, very, very upset by Brexit, because I thought it was an extraordinary piece of self-harm by the country. I mean, which indeed, I think it's proved to be, and literally sold to really nice people, black people in Sunderland, by a group of charlatans. I mean, total charlatans. So I was very upset by that, and I talked about that and how it had happened and why it had happened and the damage it was doing. But I also talked about what I'd listened to, and I'd never before in the Lords listened to people lying. Now, you're not allowed to use the word lie in the Lords. You're really not. Can't. So I talked about the extraordinary level of pig ignorance that was on display, particularly in relationship to the issues covering Ireland and the border of Ireland and the south and north. That it was deliberate. I have a problem with the word obfuscation. It was absolutely. It was a lie. They didn't know what they were doing. They knew they had a problem. They didn't know how to solve it, so they lied their way out of it. And then I also listened to an absolute crap about the trade deal they're going to make in the United States, ignoring the political reality that the Trade Committee in the United States was actually chaired by an Irish American, that there are 17 senators and congressmen around who have Irish American constituencies. And over their dead body, there was going to be a deal made that was going to affect or hurt the Republic of Ireland. So it's that kind of, people in politics are supposed to understand that stuff. And that's That's their breeding ground. When that gets ignored, and there's a man called Liam Fox, who I would say just flat out lied and hopelessly misled an entire generation of English people.
Mm.
It's going to be a generation before Britain recovers from Brexit. A generation. The damage is incalculable on young people.
Yeah, I think many of us would share that view. So you went out with something of a bang. It's probably fair to say.
Yeah, I went out with a bang.
And so, in terms of you mentioned your work in education. I mean, I guess as you said, you were the first chancellor of Sunderland University back in the late 90s. Was that the beginning of your work in that field? Would you say?
It was the first time. It was a request to become chancellor. I wasn't even sure what chancellors did, to be honest. But Sunderland didn't have a chancellor, and the then vice chancellor invited me to take the gig. And I did. I came and spent a couple of days up at the university. I was knocked out by the St. Peter's campus. I really was. I was blown away by it. And I regard it as a huge privilege. We did an interesting thing. In my inauguration, I was allowed to have an honorary doctorate, grant an honorary doctorate.
Right.
So I granted it to Ridley Scott. But Ridley was a bit of a problem. Ridley was shooting in Los Angeles at the time. And the hour change was tricky. So poor Rid had to get up at 5:30 in the morning. It was the first time we'd ever used video conferencing in that way.
Oh, really?
So on the big screen at the Tom Cowie Theatre, there's Ridley at 5 o'clock in the morning in all of his gowns, and I'm bestowing an honorary doctorate at the University of Sunderland on him. So that was a kind of high risk thing. Could have gone very wrong.
But it must have been a great thrill, because obviously you've known him most of your career.
Oh, it's wonderful. I mean, it was a wonderful thing to be able to do, and I think he was pretty thrilled. But what was interesting, because I didn't really know what chancellors did, and therefore probably, I don't know, what words you like to use, probably didn't have sufficient respect for the role. I'd like to think, and in fact I did, I think I reinvented what chancellors did. I really made it fun. I really set out to be the public face of the university. I put myself about a lot. Peter Fiddler and I, who was the next Vice Chancellor, used to go and visit primary schools in our gowns and talk to kids about the fact that because this is the mid-90s, the common feature, and this is so sad to say, when I used to go out and talk about the university in Sunderland or just in the region, was, well, university, not for the likes of us. That there was not an expectation of going to university. Yeah. It was the thing other people did. Yeah. So we actually had to sell hard the concept of the expectation of university. And I think I did a bloody good job. I worked for a decade doing that, and I'm very proud of what I did at uni. And then I was a bit like a football transfer. I'd done that well enough that I got transferred to the Open University. Well, I think I was less successful, actually.
But I think you wouldn't find many people now with that attitude that university is for someone else. I think, again, if that's a legacy, then it's a pretty good one. It's a pretty accurate one, I think.
Yeah. I think it is. I mean, as I said, it wasn't just me. Peter Fiddler, David Bell's doing it now. Paul Callahan. I mean, there's innumerable heroes. Actually, Tom Cowie and Peter Vardy. I mean, a lot of people were phenomenally helpful. I mean, I can't pretend it wasn't just me. It's just that I was lucky enough to be the front man, and sufficiently undignified to do whatever was required that got attention.
I think there's something to be said for not having a tight brief, because then you can just make it what you want it to be, can't you?
I mean, I know you've spoken to Paul. I mean, we made it up as we went along.
Well, indeed, Paul was one of our guests recently, and has been very active in business in Sunderland and the North East, and now more latterly in the sort of the cultural world with the fire station and the music trust. And I think he's just another person who just gets things done. And if there are rules, but let's just make things happen. And he's very passionate, which came across very clearly in the podcast he did.
He's a very, very, very fine man. I'd like to think he'll be properly recognised under Labour government, because I think he hasn't been. Me off.
Probably, I'm not sure when you were in Sunderland last, but it's probably changed quite a bit since then. Even if that was just a year or two ago, there are some amazing things happening.
I was up about 5-6 weeks ago. We did a screening at the fire station of Chariots of Fire. We had a
Oh, really?
great evening. Yeah, it was wonderful.
Brilliant.
Came up with Nigel Havers. We had a really good time.
Because I'm sure, as I'm sure you're aware, there's moves afoot to create a phenomenal, if it happens, film studio in Sunderland, and we're hoping to have Leo Perlman of Full Well 73, who's one of the key people in that, on the podcast at some point. That's something that I don't think anyone in Sunderland or the North East generally had ever had on their kind of list of things that might happen in Sunderland, a film studio on the banks of the Wear. I mean, as someone who's from that world, I mean, what sort of impact would that have, do you think?
I think if things go well, and I'm sure Leo will do a very good job. If things go well, it could have an enormous impact. You know, one of the problems, I taught film at the university for a decade, and the biggest problem there, working with Northern Film and Media, was getting people to believe that it could be part and parcel of the skill set that the region developed. But it's now a huge part of the economy. I mean, I think the creative industries, of which you're part, is I think over 7.2% of the total economy. That's bigger than almost anything. It's bigger than financial services.
Yeah, and I think when you look at the impact that Nissan arriving in Sunderland, whatever it was, 30 or so years ago, that it's, you know, in terms of the supply chain, I mean, film studios require all sorts of skills to flourish. So it could be an absolute game changer, couldn't it?
Oh yeah, I mean, you know, the catering world, as you say, the design world. There's all sorts of things that feed into it. The biggest single challenge will be developing the skill sets you're going to need, so that you're not having to haul people up from London, which would become extremely, well, very, very expensive.
And that's very much the world you're in now. Is that right? The sort of the teaching and skills around filmmaking. Yeah, and you do that from your.
I'm trying to do the same thing here in West Cork that we set out to do in the Northeast 10 years ago.
So you have your own studio where you deliver online lectures and seminars?
I'm sitting in it right now.
Right.
It's very elaborate and very, very well equipped. I've got 1,000 megs of broadband, and it works. You know, and I basically deliver seminars all over the world.
And that's to universities, film schools?
Yeah, universities, colleges, film schools. And what we've been doing recently, we have a scheme here called the Transition Year, where 16-year-olds get a choice of what they're going to do between 16 and 17 before going on to the next group of exams. And so we're building film and television and special effects studies into that transition year. We did it as a pilot for West Cork, around here. We are extending that next year, or later this year actually, into the whole of Munster. So you know, again, same thing, trying to get an awareness of our industries onto onto what is a possible skill set. You know, I live in a farming community, so the idea that you were employed in Ireland, in this part of the world, in anything other than either retail or farming was quite unusual. So we're introducing something quite unique here.
And that's the only way to make change, isn't it? Is to start making change. It's interesting because we, as in RTC North, we've in a couple of weeks' time we have a big STEM fest in Yorkshire. So it's 3 days and lots of engineering companies and thousands of kids coming to see what the career possibilities are. And I was thinking about that and how there's been a big focus on STEM and studying those sorts of subjects for a long time. But there's not quite so much of a focus on the more artistic careers, which, as you said, are a big part of the economy. But I guess in some respects, the film world now is so technologically driven that the boundaries are kind of blurred, perhaps, between the two.
I think it's one of the areas which has done well. You know, I worked with Chris Smith when he was culture minister, and then Tessa Jowell. I think we got a fair shake from Gordon Brown. Don't forget, invented the first tax breaks for filmmaking, so they were done by the Labour cabinet. But to their credit, George Osborne picked up on it and extended it. And Sunak has shown, it's one of the areas that Sunak's shown a serious interest in. In fact, you probably read a lot of jokes about the fact that the instant he's out of work, he's going to go to Hollywood and become a film producer, rather like Obama. So who knows? But he certainly has shown a lot of interest in how to get the industry to thrive, and particularly looking at sub £50 million films. How do you get those made? How do you get
Right.
films made about our own experiences as opposed to just being the manufacturing entity for superhero movies?
Yeah. Yeah. So what's next? Would you say for yourself and for the kind of the world you have around you?
I am. I'm 83. I promised myself and my missus that by the end of 2026, that's I'll be 85. I will not be doing anything that requires me to be there at certain moments and times. So I'm going to try and have a life where I can dip in and out of things. There are places I'd like to take my missus to around the world that she hasn't seen, that I have seen. So yeah, these are the tasks. I think these are genuinely the last 2 hyperactive years of my life. I'll still do stuff, but I want to do it at my own pace and when I'm ready for it.
Well, I think many of us would hope that we could also be as hyperactive as you are at the age that you're at. So it's certainly something for me to aspire to. Well, David, if anyone who's wondering why I'm not using David's full title, you did request not to be addressed as Lord Putnam.
No, when I retired. That's it. I mean, it was very nice for whatever number of years. Actually, the thing I most enjoyed was being Sir David. You get into a taxi.
Really?
And, oh, hello, Sir David. Right. I like that. It was kind of friendly. Lord Putnam's pretty intimidating for people. It's like a barrier placed between you and humanity. So I'm quite happy to be free of it, to be honest.
So of the two, you'd rather be a knight than a lord. Well, it's nice to have the choice, I suppose.
I just enjoyed the title, Sir David, because I thought it was friendly and jolly, and it was acknowledgement of what you've done. I say, Lord, unfortunately, the very title here in Ireland, I mean, this is not a title used here. Lord's here, and there's people who behave disgracefully. So, yes.
Yeah, it probably conjures up the wrong sort of image in where you are now. Yeah. Well, it's been delightful to speak to you. We're so grateful that you've given us some of your time. Northern Spotlights is usually for people who are based in the north and doing things in the north, but I think given all of the various, not just connections, but the work that you've done here, we'll consider you a northerner for the purposes of this podcast.
Quite seriously, the ceremony at which was granted the freedom of the city of Sunderland, one of the more important ceremonies of my life. That was a very big deal at the time. Very, very big deal. And, I've got the certificate on the wall in there. And similarly with Gateshead. So I do feel myself still terribly, terribly drawn. It's also one of the most beautiful parts of the world. The other thing I always telling people how beautiful it is. And, I still think we've got a job to do to sell the beauty of the Northeast.
Well, I tend to agree, but at the same time, we don't want to tell everyone because we do like the nice, quiet beaches. So,
well, I feel the same way about West Cork, but I'm not sure we've succeeded in not telling because here in August it becomes mayhem.
Really?
Oh, God.
Well, I'm sure when Crownworks Studios is complete and they're looking for someone suitable to cut the ribbon, I would hope you would be top of the list. And when that day comes, hopefully not too far off, it would be lovely to see you back in Sunderland.
Well, thank you very, very much, Terry.
So, David, it's been a delight. It's been lovely to see you. Thank you again for your time.
Great pleasure. Look after yourselves and all the luck in the world with your business.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.